Back to when you were an itty bitty girl. And just so I get a sense of what your family was like. Could you describe your mother for me?
Well, I'd have to be about 5, I think, because the memory of it was always a different thing than in my mind than the real thing. I thought she was so beautiful. She was beautiful.
And I want you to say it with your mother.
I remember my mother vividly the second time she came into my life. I was taken to be with her when I was about 5 years old. And she was beautiful to me, like my idea of a movie star, though I didn't know anything about movies then. But she had big hazel eyes, hazel color, and curly black hair, and very, very fair skin. And I think she made her makeup very pale too, so I remember that, and I remember she had beautiful hands, and she was always, this way with them, and I noticed them a lot. And then as I got older, I knew she was beautiful all the time, because I think she wanted terribly to be an actress. And I suppose when she went back to work when I was about 3 years old, she had the makeup always, and the way she was dressed and she appeared to me was as someone on the stage, remote from me.
As you look back on it, at that time, was it that realistic to have a career on stage for a black woman?
At that time, I think it must have been ridiculous. I didn't know then how bad the time was for her and girls, women like her. But I remember being taken away from a place where there had been a lynching, and she had gone to work in a Silas Green show, tent show, and we had been in a car, and someone warned us, don't go in tonight to do the show because there's been a lynching. And I saw a lot of fear in her and the people that were with her. And then I was in Philadelphia with her when I was still, this must have been the same year, at the Earl Theater, I believe it was. And I was playing the child in a crib in Madam X. They were doing this on the stage. And I remember it was either Madam X or some way down east or something. And there were 2, 3 other little children, must have been way down east. And we hid behind the fireplace but I was frightened then because the play was frightening. The story was sad or something, and I began to cry and make a loud noise, and they had to take me off the stage. But I remember just her having a bad time. Now I know how horrible it really was, but then it was frightening.
Well, how did you come to actually be on the road with her? Could you tell me about what we will call the kidnapping?
My mother and father, I think I should tell you that my mother and father had a very unpleasant divorce. I think my mother was too naive and had been sheltered so that she didn't understand how hard it was for a young black man to make it. And he was annoyed at her having wishes to read movie magazines and go on the stage. So they were really unsuited for each other. And when they were divorced, my mother, of course, they always gave girl children to mothers in those years. And my mother took me for a time with her whenever she was able to, because she said my father threatened to kidnap me always. My father wanted me back. And I was a sort of cabbage torn between a couple of people, you know, with the leaves being taken off. And always when she'd leave me with people who were kind enough to take me in, she'd come at weird times and say, we've got to leave. And it would be in the middle of the night usually, and she'd take me off and say, your father's in town or is coming to where we are, and you've got to get away. I've got to take you, because he's going to take you away from me. I had one of those real movie story bringing up with two people disliking each other. And unfortunately, the 2 or 3 times I was with people who were kind to me and that I had gotten sort of liking them, she'd come and take me away. And I guess that stuck with me for many long years, because I began to always want to be the one who left first. I didn't want to. I was afraid to love people. They might leave me. They always did, usually, when I was young. But that was the way it was.
Well, one of the things I was really struck by was your experience in Macon, Georgia, because I think you sort of...
Yes.
Could you tell me about that?
When I lived in Macon, Georgia, I don't know how my mother had met these people, but they were so kind to me. They were very poor, and we lived in these 2 rooms, and there was 100 and some odd year old great great grandmother who cooked and washed out in the big pot in the backyard, and made soap, and there were the mother, the granddaughter, who was raising her daughter's child, and the 4 of us women lived in these 2 rooms, and I had a little cot at the foot of the great-grandmother's bed, and we'd roast potatoes in the ashes in the little front room, and it had a big iron stove in the back, and the mother worked for white people, and she'd bring us little tidbits home on a plate, and the old grandmother was so wonderful. She was very lean and wiry, and she'd tell us stories of when she was a little girl, and they were so good to me. And she'd make baking soda biscuits that rose high and have a fat back, you know, and fry it in the morning for us before school, or to take to school with us. I remember that. And when I'd had rheumatic pains in my legs, she'd wrap them at night, and I'd be groaning, and she'd put a vinegar in brown paper, I remember. And that was one family I didn't want to be taken away from. Of all the many that I was left with, I remember them. And
well, you had rheumatic pains in your legs?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Probably had fever. I don't know, rheumatic fever. And well, you know, people didn't think so much about drinking orange juice on our side of town. And I remember the first asparagus I ever tasted was on one of those plates she brought home from her work. And I probably didn't eat properly as I was growing, you know. But they were very good to me. On the other hand, I lived with a family once, rather middle class, in Georgia, and they had children, and I felt rather like a little an orphan child, but they had one member of the family, their aunt, who gave me books to read, and she was a teacher, and she wouldn't tell them if I was reading late at night by the light from the hall, and she was good to me, whereas the people themselves were rather high and mighty, but I had a taste of every kind of household.
Well, how did you get to Fort Valley, Georgia?
Well, while I was living in Macon, Georgia, there came a car, an automobile, down the alley. There were a lot of alleys in those days they lived in Macon. And in it was my Uncle Frank and two other people. And my uncle was very, very fair with blue eyes and blondish hair, and the few people that were out in the dust, with me playing, thought that there had come a white man into the alley. And so we were staring at these people, and he came up to me and he said, "You don't remember me, but I'm your Uncle Frank." And I remembered the name of my father's brother, and he said, "And I've come to take you away with me to school." And of course I was, disbelieving and saying, "Well, what will my mother say?" And he said, "Your mother isn't here, is she?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, I think she'd give permission because I am your father's brother." And off I went with them, and they drove me to Fort Valley, Georgia, which isn't too far from Macon. And he said, "You're going to live with me now, and you're going to go to school at this little Carnegie-endowed grade school." And he said, "And I'm the president. I'm not the president, but I'm the head of faculty over across the road at Fort Valley High and Industrial School." And it was a school supported by religious people, religious groups, and they taught farming and how cooking, and they were canning peaches, which is very, very big in Georgia. And it was an industrial school, really, for black people. And I lived with in the dormitory, the big people's dormitory, with his fiancée, who was a teacher also. And I'd go across the road to school in the morning. But I loved it there because, well, my uncle was in charge, and I was with so many of my own people, and all from all over the country. And we walked a lot, and there were scuppernong grapes and persimmons growing, and it was like the tropics to me. And I still had memories of Harlem and in New York, so that was just wonderful to be in a place like Fort Valley. And I remembered one teacher I'd had there for years named Mrs. Walden, and she taught crafts, and I made African baskets, with corn shucks and all that. And I heard the choirs sing good, beautiful, and I was a part of a unit. The first main thing I was, and I felt good. I always wanted to piece the family somewhere, since they broke up my first one. And that's why I liked Fort Valley.
Well, I was reading in your book, the first autobiography you wrote, about the first time you heard this rehearsal at Fort Valley of Romeo and Juliet. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember that too well.
Okay.
But I did remember one theatrical thing that I did with a group of the kids from our school. We did a version of some kind of romantic thing. I don't know what it was called. There was a prince and there were people and I had a part in it. That I remember because I remember the one song that I sang. Someday my prince will come. Da, ba, 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 ba. Something like that. And maybe that's what I wrote about. I don't really remember too well.
What struck me about reading this memory that you had was that you weren't in the play, but you were just witnessing it for the first time.
Maybe I watched them do, the big people do a rehearse for a play. I got the idea I had always was, what I thought about the stage was that I was in a cocoon, a nest. I was with relatives. And I always was so hungry to, be back with my grandparents or be with my mother somewhere and relatives. And so a play looked protective. It looked like you were in a nest with other people. And I guess I started liking that kind of show business.
Well, speaking of your grandparents,
Yes.
what was it like in Brooklyn? Tell me about your grandmother, Cora.
Well, my grandmother and my grandfather came to New York from Nashville and from Atlanta, Georgia, in the last migration that came up from the South, along with people like the coachmen and bakers and tailors and everything that came up from the South to the Promised Land. And I didn't know about them at first, but I learned afterward. They came up because when my grandmother had the child before the last, she swore that I found an old letter of hers that she had written to my father, telling why she had come up north. She said, I'll never raise another child in this place. My grandmother was a very privileged daughter of a free black man who owned property in Atlanta and was very respected and raised his daughters. Her sister Lena, and she was Cora, raised them to be ladies, and they had everything. But the prejudice that they had from knowing that no matter how rich they were and how comfortable they were nothing compared to the white people who saw them on the street or who owned some kind of store they were passing by. They had all the disadvantages of being black in the South, but had very beautiful life with their own people who had money. And that doesn't mean that everybody did have, certainly, and they were privileged, but she was a very smart woman, and she graduated from Atlanta University when she was 16, she and her sister, and she wanted something better. She thought she'd get it in the North. That used to be the paradise. And my grandfather, she met him. His mother was an Indian, and he was very, very fair also, but completely black. That is to say, he chose to have put on his identity papers that he was black, though he was an Indian, actually. But there were many like that, I hear, in those days. And they came east and thought it would be better. And they found that it was pretty rough here. My grandfather was relegated to jobs that he had been an editor of a paper, and a poet and a teacher and principal of schools all when he was coming up. Well, here he got a job in the fire department as an inspector of combustibles, but he'd go around to all the fires and investigate arson-tinted places, but he wouldn't get promoted. And white people who were not as knowledgeable as he was were given the jobs. The same old story, you know. And my grandmother busied herself in social work completely. She was a suffragette, and she worked with teenage unwed mothers and black boys who couldn't get a decent education, and her life was just all do it for my people, do it for my people, do it for my people. And consequently, whenever I lived there with them, I had the advantage of knowing what was right, but I also knew what was wrong. And I never got hugs or kisses or a relaxation of affection or something, but I got taught what to do and what not to do, and what to think of myself and what to think of what happened to me as a person. And when I was taken away from them, off and on, I clung to what I had heard them say, rather than the terror and the fright and the hard aches of my mother, because I realized that my mother was very unhappy. She wanted a fairy tale. She wanted a life of glamour and the theater. And there was no way for her to work except in the children's circuit, you know, as it was called. And she was a frustrated actress, and so I always felt sorry, and I understood her, because she was single-minded, and it was very unlogical, unrealistic at those times to want what she wanted. And she must have been very beautiful and very unhappy.
Well,
I learned that. I learned that during all the years about her.
that put you in somewhat of an uncomfortable position as a child, because you felt all of this pain of your mother's. And it seems that a lot of your experiences led you to protect her instead of the other way around.
I was always protective of my mother, because not only my grandmother, but as I got older, but other people who were snide about her, perhaps, or, oh, why doesn't your mother do for you, and this, that, and the other. And my grandmother saying, I don't want you to be like your mother. I don't want you to be like your mother. So I was loyal to her, and I fought with my grandmother about that. But my grandmother was just making me stronger. I realized that, because that was her way. She's not going to let me have an illogical thought or an unrealistic attitude about life. She wanted it to be tough, because she wanted me to be tough, because she thought that my mother's softness and desire to be beautiful and lovely on the stage was crazy, was silly. And she didn't have any respect for it. But always for your mother you feel something, this thing in you. And I took up for my mother. I took up for my mother, and was fierce about that. But I think it gave me a lot of strength. I think it did.
Well, you learned a lot of fierceness.
Had a lot of teachers.
When you went to school, well, let me skip forward a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Can I? I'm sorry. Yeah. What's the matter? Okay. I wanted to ask you about that one unpleasant incident where you sort of began to get the message that you really had to be very good. You had to make sure that you didn't do anything to disturb your mother. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that lady who basically, when your mother was very sick, was constantly pushing you?
For a while, my mother was ill. When she first took me to Florida, that's right after I had my first Jimco train ride. But anyway, she was very ill, and I was having to be very quiet and not make a move to upset her because she was very nervous also. And there was a lady who was rather abusive to me, and I knew that I had to be very good. First of all, I didn't want to disturb my mother, and I wanted to be good because I didn't like being messed about with. And as I stayed there longer with them before I came back to Birmingham, Alabama, I think. But anyway, I had gotten it into my head that I had to be good. I had to be very good, very careful not to offend whoever house I lived in, be very grateful for the food, and do my best to keep out of people's way. And I think early on I began to have a sense of knowing that what I did would be reflected upon my mother, who had to leave me with these people, and I didn't want her to be angry or unhappy. And I knew that if I was objectionable in any way whatsoever, they'd throw me out, and I couldn't be with my mother at certain times. And that became a pattern for me for a great deal of my life. I became very secretive. I became very suspicious of everyone. I became unable to be my real self, which I suppose then was just being a kid, and laughing and talking and being obnoxious. But I learned that very early because I stayed with many different sorts of people. And I guess that came over into my adulthood. And made me a little schizo, I think. I'm probably two people. I used to go back to live with my grandparents when my mother would send me away from other people. And I'd come up north and had to lose my southern accent, and I'd come up north so I could get back with my friends over in Brooklyn. And I had we were a bunch of girls, and called the debutantes or something. I don't know. But I liked her very much. Her name was Ruth, and she had an older brother. And I had such a crush on him when I was, I don't know, what age, and I would go to PS 35, and for my last year in grade school, I think, or maybe just before the last, and I'd go over to her house because she had a wonderful mother, and her name was Ruth Johnson then, and she had a mother who was beautiful and so good to us and to me, and Ruth and I would have club meetings with the rest of the girls in the group. We'd go around to each other's houses, and we'd walk to school, and Brooklyn then was heaven. It was a beautiful city, and beautiful churches and beautiful trees, and you could walk for blocks to each other's homes or get on the trolley car and go, and those were the best times I had. And Ruth was always a very down-to-earth type girl, and her aspirations were, I suppose, kind of sensible, I thought, to me. I guess I was always kind of giddy and dreamy and silly. And we'd go to the movies when we could. And that was it, my lifetime in Brooklyn.
Do you remember the slam books?
Yes, I think so. We used to write what we thought about. Evidently, kids have done that for many, many years. I didn't realize it, but we wrote what we thought about things and boys and who wore what and who didn't wear what. I think I remember that. And her mother could cook too. My grandmother never cooked, and my granddaddy and I would, when he'd get home from work, I'd meet him outside the house, and we'd walk to the local delicatessen and get our suppers, And my grandmother never touched a pot or pan, but that was her raising. She had somebody to do it for her. But it was nice in those times that I was there in Brooklyn. And I used to go to St. Peter Claver's church, and we were a nice set of people, girls and guys, fellows. And that was, to me, life, real life, other than the kind of theatrical other side of my bringing up.
Ruth was telling me that back then, you had a voice then, and they used to make you sing all the time.
Did they? No, well, we all used to know the latest songs. I remember that. And I'd sing, and Adelaide Holbrook would sing. That was one of my other girlfriends. But I didn't think anything of it because everybody sang. We didn't sing folk music, or we didn't sing spirituals very much. We were not we were a kind of Episcopal Catholic group. Didn't know too much about Baptist. And I don't say it from a sense of glee or happiness or anything, but I say it because we were all very uneducated to life outside our groups. They were all people, offsprings of people who were Catholic or Episcopal, and we didn't know much about the Baptist faith until I got older then, of course.
How did you feel when you basically had to leave the group to go to the Cotton Club?
Well, I cried, and I went over, told them, and her mother was very understanding, Ruth's mother. I cried when I heard that I would go into the Cotton Club. I never thought it would happen, not because of me wanting it, but because it just had never gotten into my mind that I would go on the stage. We swooned over the movies of the time, Warner Brothers musicals and everything. But we had no, the first hero I think we had was Cab Calloway, my group, I mean. And Cab was working at the Brooklyn Paramount. And we cut school one afternoon, Ruth, me, 2, 3 others, I don't know, and we went to see Cab Calloway. And he was the most beautiful thing we'd ever seen, and big famous man. And he was working at the Cotton Club in the first show I went into, and imagine my surprise.
Was that exciting for you to suddenly be working with your idol?
I think it was probably in the first week I was hired, and they were already in rehearsal for the show when I went up to the Cotton Club. And I was sitting there with some of the girls, and in Cab Calloway walked, and I was really surprised, and he said, "Hey, Brooklyn, what are you doing here?" And he remembered me from Brooklyn because he had done a benefit for the local, one of the Brooklyn organizations, I don't know, I don't remember what it was for. But he came, and we were usherettes, Ruth and all the girls and me. We passed programs out. And he remembered us from there. I remembered me, and I was just taken aback. And, of course, my mother was there at my rehearsals and every night from then on. So I was not allowed, really. And in my heart, I always got crushes on the musicians who were sitting in the bandstand. I didn't pay attention to the leaders. I like those horn blowers.
How appropriate that your name Lena Horne.
Yeah.
Can we talk to the? It's like upstairs. Cut.
What are you doing? What does he do with those?
Oh, those are for publicity still, so
Oh.
that we can let folks know this is going to be on. Who was Mrs. Laura Rollick?
Oh, she was the first.
Just use her
Oh,
name.
yeah. Mrs. Laura Rollick was the first. Well, one of the few people that treated me like a child, like a young person, who was good to me, made me take my bath, made me keep clean, fed me. She had the top floor of a brownstone, and I lived with her, and she got me a little tiny radio, and she was like I imagine a mother would be, and she was kind of roly-poly, and she worked for older people in a retirement sort of home, and she was a widow, and my few months that I had with her were wonderful because she made me behave and made me stop biting my nails and made me be aware of that I should entertain the other girls, and because they always gave little food and everything when we go to club meetings. So she'd make me chicken salad and everything for my friends, and she made me practice on the piano, and she was really wonderful to me, and she sewed a beautiful gown for me to wear in a production on the stage we did to raise money for the Lincoln Follies, it was called. And I was sorry to leave her, because that was when my mother and my stepfather, my new stepfather, came back from Cuba, where they had been living, and they took me away to the Bronx.
How had you come to live with Mrs. Rollick? What had happened?
my Uncle Frank had a fiancée that I lived with in a dormitory in Fort Valley, Georgia. And I came to know Mrs. Rollock because his fiancée's mother and father took me to her and asked if she could, take on this kid. And
let me stop you just a moment, because what I really want to get at, because we don't know yet, is that your grandmother died.
Yeah. Well, that's...
No, just in terms of the chronology, that's why you ended up there.
Yes.
You go ahead.
When my grandmother died, it was about a year after my mother had come up from Cuba with my new stepfather and had taken me to live with them in the Bronx. My grandmother, meanwhile, was very ill, and I'd call Ruth and she'd tell me how she was, and I got word from my Uncle Bert that my grandmother had died, and I was being moved away from Mrs. Rollock and had my few little things packed up to go to the Bronx with my mother. And I went, it was in walking distance of Mrs. Rollock's house and my grandmother. And I walked over there. I have to back up because I have to tell you that my mother and my stepfather were stopping at this hotel. And I knew that I had to leave Mrs. Rollock and be with them. Meanwhile, I was in touch with my Uncle Bert and my grandmother, our house, that is. And so when they called me and told me, I told my mother that I had to go to my grandmother. It's a time in my life I don't really like to talk about after all these years even, but I had to go, and I walked, and they came after me in a taxi car, and I was standing outside my grandmother's house, and my Uncle Bert was there trying to talk to me. And I felt deeply about my grandmother's death because my grandmother was the center, the core of me, because I made me Brooklyn and 189 Chauncey Street and PS 35 and Girls High School. I made that my life. That was my life. The other was something else. And my grandmother dying was I had nobody to say, Lena, you are, And my mother wouldn't permit me to get into the funeral cars that were stationed there. My mother was on the sidewalk crying. I was on the bottom of the step crying. My father, my stepmother, my grandfather, my Uncle Frank, they were all in these cars. And I think that was the first time I just realized that. But my Santa had gone, and we screamed at each other. I remember, even though I was 15 then, 14 and a half, 15, and screamed at each other, and she said terrible things, and my father was very stoic. Called me over, and she wouldn't let me walk toward him, so he came over to me and he said, be brave, your grandmother knows how you feel. And they all drove off and left me there on the street with my mother and my stepfather, who was standing back, sort of out of the way. And that just took out a half of me, you know. So then I went back up to the Bronx, and then it was very bad because my stepfather had no job because his English was very poor, and my mother had no job, and I was there and had to be fed, so that's the way the Cotton Club evolved.
Well, it was also the Depression, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
What did that mean to be there in the Depression?
Well, I was never any better off than anybody else in a depression. I think everybody felt something because I had no button-down family that I could turn to. Many of the people I was with were all in the bad shape. Mrs. Rollick being a widow and very little income coming in, she was in bad shape. And the people in Macon, Georgia, who kept me, they were in bad shape. But the people who were kind to me, it seemed never to be about not being fed, because I was punished by people by not giving me food when I was bad or something. I didn't take it the same way. The Depression, my grandmother and my grandfather were not very well off. My grandmother didn't eat a lot and didn't cook a lot, and my grandfather and I ate delicatessen, and I was never around people that made food a situation. In the South, they seemed to have food. They grew food, I think, but I was never with a very luxurious family, except the ones I lived with who were sort of middle class. They were doctors and seemed to have a little better food, better table. And a lot of poor stage people that my mother left me with, they shared spare ribs or rice with me, or beans, you know. I guess food didn't bother me, but I was aware of a depression, a way of life. We didn't have many things to wear, didn't think about that. That's odd. I don't know. My grandmother's, we had books, and I ate a book.
I understand that now you do devour books. Is that so?
Well, I guess it's a long ago habit I picked up. Yeah.
Moving forward.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of them is coming out of this middle-class environment in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
That was a little hoo-ha about you dancing in the Cotton Club. Could you tell me about that? Because I think Mrs. Rollick was upset too, wasn't she?
When I went into the Cotton Club, everybody that I had left in Brooklyn, of course, was horrified. And a few in New York, too. I remember the black press was, they were a little angry. And my people, most of them over in Brooklyn that I knew, had always had a view, not always, but it seems that they had been a view of black people on the stage as sort of second-class people. But it's not hard to realize that all they had seen of black shows was the kind of things that the establishment made it appear. I mean, we worked in the South, and they worked in the South on tent shows or wherever they could, and had attitudes, how people had to sit in the top galleries to see a show. They were minstrels and artificial people, or else aping the white shows and small stock companies. There was not, and there were singers who were respected, who went around the country singing, but there were no dignified, they thought, people to be admired on the black stage, because that's what we were. We were second-rate, looked down on by churchgoers and intellectuals, and but not recognizing artistry, not seeing that we were artists. Those girls up in the Cotton Club were artists, but they had no other place to work, and they had to work hard and be at the mercy of whatever their bosses said or did. And there was no respect for black theater for so long. And black actors, yes, there was Burt Williams, a great star, and my grandfather knew about him and admired him, but he was in a white show, and but people like Bessie Smith, who was out on the road with black shows, and before Ethel Waters, we were rather looked down upon as artistic people, so that my folks over in Brooklyn said, well, that's terrible. She's just going to be with those second-rate people, and we're Brooklynites, and she shouldn't be. And not knowing that I had to, feed a couple of people, and realizing that I needed a job, because their households were not rich, but they were reasonably able to just go and work hard on a job and come home and have a house and family and be wonderful people, but apart from show folk, so that I worked for a while, a year probably, until they realized that I wasn't going to go to the dogs,
Did you internalize any of this feeling yourself, that maybe what you were doing wasn't quite respectable, wasn't quite as good enough?
No, because I didn't like my stepfather, and he couldn't be a supporter, and I was, and I had at least to say, I didn't say it, I didn't dare say it, but I could say to my mother, if I didn't have this job, we wouldn't eat, or we couldn't pay the rent. And the times were very hard. Yes, it was a depression. And we did get turkeys from the club owners, who passed out free turkeys at Thanksgiving and at Christmas. And I knew I was with other girls who didn't have it good either, and some had babies. And they had been in that business a while, and they knew what they couldn't do without this club. And many acts who were just marvelous didn't have any place to work up there but the Cotton Club, and they respected it, so that I had two sides. I could hear my one side of my family saying, "Oh, isn't that awful?" And I could see on the other side the girls that I worked with who were good to me, who were saying, "Yes, good we got this job," It was two sides to every story.
And you also wrote about that you were really also protected too. I mean,
oh yeah,
fathers,
yeah.
friends,
I was very protected all the while I was in Harlem. My father, I loved my father terribly, and I loved him all the more because he had been the one who was good to my grandmother. He wasn't there often. He'd come, but he sent my grandmother on a grand tour to Europe, and he sent me clothes, and he sent her money, because my grandfather was not able to be at his best. And so even though I didn't see him very much, I adored him. I had pictures of him too. And my father was a gangster. I mean, not with a gun, but he was a number banker. He was a number runner to begin with. He worked with other black men like him who would rather, who knew they didn't have a chance with the establishment. And so they took advantage of it. And they worked for people who were organized, and he and his buddy worked for people of Dutch Schultz's group, and I was never ashamed of my father, because to me he was like a cowboy. He was daring, and all my life that I was around him, he was wonderful because he was from the street, and he had friends then all up in Harlem, and they somehow knew from tribal drums that I was there. I was Teddy's daughter. I was in the Cotton Club. I was virtuous, or whatever that means, and that he was my father. And I'd be walking along the street sometime, and guys would pass me, and they'd say, "Hi, how's Teddy's daughter?" You know, I was never alone up there, and I was never bothered by anything. My father's influence was, they liked him. He was an honest man. He kept his word, which he taught me, and he was a hero to me, and I've never had any trouble with anybody. And I was, so-called jailbait in those days.
I just want to, in terms of our chronology here, just to get a sense of, there came a point at which your situation with your mother and your stepfather became intolerable. And I think it may have come to a head while you were with Noble Sissel. Could you tell me about that?
I went on the road with Noble Sissel's orchestra, and Sissel had a very reputable aura. He had been very famous in the First World War, he and his partner, and they gave me this job with them. And Sissel was very determined that I would never be like the stereotype, stereotype person that other people had put on show people. He was determined that I was not going to be like the people who were pictured as hot, sexy, colorful ladies, And my training began sort of there, making me a very ladylike Lena Horne, and as opposed to my dancing in the chorus at the Cotton Club. And he was rather like a very fuddy-duddy schoolmaster, I imagine. And he didn't want me to be like he thought other people had made black women seem. All of us very hot, very sexy. So he also taught me deportment on stage, how to walk on stage gracefully, how to sell whatever I was doing. And it was fine for a while, but my mother and my stepfather were with me. And my stepfather, unfortunately, had a very bad view of black people. And because I traveled we traveled in the bus with the whole orchestra, and many great musicians in Mr. Sissel's orchestra. We traveled with them, and they had to find places where they could stay. There were no hotels or rooming houses, a few, and they mostly, through the years that they had been with Sissel, had found families that they could move in with during the times we were there in their cities. And But my stepfather resented it terribly. He didn't understand black men. And so I just got sick of hearing him disrespectful of the men I was working with. And something in me rebelled against it, and I'll fight for that sort of thing. I don't know why you black people why do these men put up with it? Why don't they fight? And why don't they? Well, he was a revolutionary from Cuba. I knew nothing about that, and he obviously knew nothing about our problems. And it drove me away from them in my heart, and turned me toward I had to get away from them. And that's when I had to leave them, and I got married. I ran away and got married. Woefully unprepared to be a wife, but it was better than not fighting every minute from my stepfather and mother.
Let me know in the comments, what year did you get married?
Did you take a break from your career at that point when you got married, or were you?
Well, I thought I had. When I got married, I thought that's the end. I don't have to be in show business. My mother doesn't have to worry about me going to bed with somebody. My stepfather will not be with me. I am going to run away and get away from this. And it met this young man. It might have been any other young man except that he lived in Pittsburgh, and that's where my father lived. And I met him with my father. And you see, I really wanted to marry my father, so I got caught up in this whole situation. And my father couldn't marry me, of course, but I was happy being around him, and he was happy with having me there. And I had always believed that you had to marry the person, so I got married and didn't know how to boil water. I could be attractive and dance around on the stage, but I didn't know what to do in that kitchen. But I learned.
I've heard so many tales of how good you are in the kitchen. Where did you learn it from?
Well, I learned to cook some things pretty, mostly because I read so much, and I've had recipes from days gone by, but also everywhere I lived with different people that I lived with earlier on, I had watched them, watch what they did, watch how you take a stain off a pot by putting a piece of lemon in and boiling it, and all those good things you should know, And when I began to travel, I just picked up, and then my father took me to have my first lobster, and I learned to I already liked it. And my father was there in Pittsburgh, and so he took me to different, the Italian people that he ran numbers with, and I went to good restaurants that took black people in, and I had good food.
Well, you were running away from show business, but show business wasn't about to let you go, because that's when you got the call to do the Duke's Tops. We talked just briefly about it in the last interview, and I just want to go a little bit more into. That was the Duke's Tops.
When I was in Pittsburgh and had my baby, my first baby, I got a call from someone who knew me in New York. I can't remember now. Possibly Clarence Robinson, but he had talked to this white man named Gumm, Gumm, who was an agent. Evidently, they had been agents a long while back. He was an old man, I think, elderly. And they put him on the phone, and he said, it must have been Clarence. He said, we're going to make a movie with Ralph Cooper, and would you come and do it? And I said, well, no, I don't know anything about the movies anyway, plus I just had a baby. And my husband probably won't even think of it. And my husband must have said yes, and Gail, I think, was only 2 months old, and I had a friend, a wonderful family there in Pittsburgh. I can't remember her name at this minute, but she stayed with Gail, and I went out to California. First time I ever got on an airplane. And I wasn't afraid then, but anyway, I got on this airplane and went out there, and a wonderful woman named Lillian, she played the part of in Gildersleeve. She was Birdie. Lillian Randolph. She had me, I stayed at her house. She was another person very nice to me, like Hattie McDaniels. And I was crying every night because I didn't want to be away from Gail. And when I went out there, they were surprised because I was fat. I had just had a baby. And I could sing a little bit, a follow tune. They played, lovely little songs, I think, because I haven't seen it in so long. Anyway, they said, well, we're going to have to let the dress out. And they said, well, we've got to tweeze her eyebrows and do all this. And I'd cry even harder. And somehow I got through that movie, and I saw a lot of people that I eventually became friends with. And I think I was terrible, probably in the movie. And I heard Ralph tell the people, well, she used to be thin. I mean, and I had all this puppy fat plus baby fat all over me. And I don't really like to think too much about that, but my husband had been happy for me to go, not happy, but he said he'd sure go, and we could use that money, because he had problems too, being a young college black man who couldn't get arrested. And so that was my thing back in show business. And the next time I went to be in Lou Leslie's Blackbirds.
Well, when you arrived there also, wasn't there a problem with the money? The producers hadn't raised the money?
Yeah, well, it was a little upshot company, I guess. I hear it's released. They show it, I don't look, but I think I got a little money, not as much as, well, it wasn't much, I would have gone for $200, for all the time it took us. And Lillian was very good to me, and it rained all the time. I hated California. I hated California.
All right, moving forward,
yeah.
We spoke a bit about Cafe Society in the last interview, and I just wanted to ask you very specifically about Barney Josephson and why he was so special in your career.
When I went back to New York and got a job at Cafe Society, when I was in New York and got a job at Cafe Society, I was lucky, first of all, because I was with Teddy Wilson's orchestra, and I was with, for the first time, black and white people together in a cabaret, and the people that worked there were interesting to me because they were all races, and the audience was not segregated, and I saw famous people there, and they had famous black people working for them. Pearl Reynolds and Billie Holiday and Albert Ammons and Pete Johnson, Kenneth Spencer, Art Tatum, a great piano duo played boogie woogie all the time. There were famous people working there, And it was unlike any group of theatrical people I'd been around since I'd left the Cotton Club. And Barney himself was a teacher, too, in that position. And a very, I think, honest man. He knew a lot about my people. And I liked it if I talked to a white person that knew about black history, black people, and their thoughts about that and about them. And he was the one who introduced me to Paul Robeson, and he introduced me to Walter White, who was president of the NAACP, and he introduced me to Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. And I met Billy on my own, but he introduced me to Langston Hughes and people like that, of my own people. And he knew a lot about us. And so he came at a time when I had begun to want to know what my people were like, what they didn't like, or what they did like, and how had I, everybody goes through, I'm sure, time, they did in my day, when they wanted to know more, because the other side had made me so confused about the way they were toward me that I might have fallen into a trap believing that I was not what I was, what I am. And I was very young and uneducated. And he came along and introduced me to wonderful people whom I learned a lot from. I learned more. I learned to be more proud than I was. Not about me, myself, but what I am. And the people that worked there were like me. And I had a big education there from enlightened white people as well as black people.
And while you were there in New York at the Cafe Society, you had just the best, it seems, the best circle of musical friends.
That's where, and when I was in Cafe Society is where I was able to make choices. I just seemed to gravitate toward the music, toward the musicians. I learned a lot from them, especially Teddy, J.C. Hurd, J.Z. Higginbotham, John Hammond was around there. He was a great, I guess, entrepreneur of what he called basic blackness. I didn't have it, but he said, but I look good, So it was amusing to hear me try to sing a blues, which I didn't do well, so I didn't do them. But and I had all types of people, but I went toward the music. I don't know why. I guess it was just there. And the best people in the world were in a radius of Cafe Society, Kelly Stables, Cafe Society Uptown. They were just all in, and 52nd Street with all the great jazz places. And everywhere I was surrounded by, and Nat Cole and his trio and I was surrounded by brilliant musicians and actors and dancers, and I wouldn't give $15 million if I had it to give up that I had. It was wonderful. It was another family. Cafe Society, I went every night saying, well, I'm going home now. I lived in the YWCA in Harlem, and I worked at Cafe Society. until I moved to Brooklyn, and that's another story.
When you went to, while you were at the Cafe Society,
Mm-hmm.
you got a call, I believe, from Felix Young about coming out to California.
Yeah.
Could you tell me what happened there?
I got a call from California. No, it was Gum called me, who said, there's a guy going to call you named Felix Young, and talk to him. It's about going to California. And I said, no. But anyway, they called and said, come out and do a show with Ethel Waters, Duke Ellington, Catherine Dunham, and you, incidentally, at this big cafe we're going to, Mocambo in California. And I said no. But meanwhile, Barney, because I had gone, I said, they want me to come to California, you know. And Barney didn't want me to go. Teddy didn't want me to go, but two of the other musicians said yes. Basie also, my darling Basie. So anyway, I grieved and said, oh, and what am I going to do in California? And I may be able to get my children with me now, and I want to move to Brooklyn and have the house there for them, the house I was born in, and be with my family. And I've got this nice job at Cafe Society. Well, I was torn between all those people, and my father called him and to go to California to take this job. And they finally talked me into it, and I got my cousin, who was from Chicago, to come and be able to take care of Gail for me. And we flew out to California. I had both children with me at that time. And I got to California, and for 8 or 9 months had no work because they paid the rent for me. Felix Young rented this apartment, and the war scares had come along. And California seemed to be very kind of nervous about it because they're right there on the Pacific and you couldn't get materials, building materials, because they were, I guess, knew that in the future they'd have to get materials for war. And they couldn't make the stage big enough and the club make the alterations they wanted, so that I sat there for months at a time waiting for them to get open. And meanwhile, Roosevelt died. And no, he didn't die, but he announced the war, and then soon after, I mean, everything happened to make this a bad time for me in California. We couldn't open at this big cabaret. Ethel Waters had other dates to go to. Duke Ellington had dates. Catherine Dunham opened, and I was on the bill with her in a little place called the Little Truck. And it was so small that the skirts of her dancers would get in people's soup and plates around the ringside. And I was safe because I didn't need a microphone. I just stood on the corner of the stage and did what I had to do. And it was a great opening for me, but very uncomfortable for Catherine on account of space. But while she was there and while they were there, my best friends were the Dunham group, because I didn't like being in Hollywood. And that's where some people from MGM saw me working.
Tell me in the comments, who is your best friend?
Roger Eden saw you there, didn't he?
Roger Eden saw me working at the Little Truck, and he came one night, and he came back to what the backstage was and said, I want you to come out to MGM. I want you to sing for some people. And I liked him because he had this very lovely Southern accent, and I didn't usually like the sound of it, but I liked him, and I said, well, okay, I'll come out. But meanwhile, he had spoken to my agent, Mr. Gum, who had sold me to another agency called, I can't remember at this time, very famous agency. And so the percentage of me was all meted out to a lot of people. But anyway, they took me out to MGM. And they had never heard of me or anything, but Roger told them to bring me out there. And I did, thinking nothing about it. And I sang for him, and he had some people in the office with him, and then he took me to Arthur Freed. And by the time I wound up that afternoon, I had been then taken to L.B. Mayer. And the rest is sort of strange history.
Who was Arthur Freed?
Well, he was the head of a, they were, Arthur Freed was a kind of wonderful man. He was head of what was called the Freed unit. There were units. Pasternak had a unit, and all the directors, some of serious pictures were there, and it was a caste system, you know. And Arthur was a musician, and he liked music, and he was making the musicals out there. And I have to cut because I have to cough. Arthur had musicians that worked mainly for him in his unit. And Kay Thompson was in his unit. Lenny Hayton, whom I eventually married, was in his unit. Johnny Green worked for him, fine musician and conductor. And I don't know, a couple of other very famous people. Andre Previn, his son, father worked for him, and then his son, Andre. And so it was a good unit, full of fine musicians. And I asked them to get a brother named Phil Moore to come and play rehearsal piano with me finally when I was hired. But I didn't think anything about it that first day, and I went back to my job. And they said the next day when they sent me out there, these agents, they said they want to hire you. And I, for what? And they said, oh, we like the way you sing, and we want to do, we have this fine director named Vincent Minnelli. And we want him to do a piece of property he has called Cabin in the Sky. I said, oh, I saw that in New York with Miss Waters and Catherine Dunham, Miss Dunham. And they said, yes, and we're going to make that picture. And so I went home and called my father and told him what had happened. And he said, are you sure they're not going to put you in a Tarzan picture? And I said, I don't think so. But, I mean, I don't want to be in the movies because all the movies I'd seen didn't make me that happy. And I was happier at Cafe Society. So my father came, flew out to California, and went the next day with me to Mr. Mayer. And went to Mr. Freed first, and Mr. Freed said, well, Mr. Mayer. So we went to Mr. Mayer's office. And my father gave him the drawings, Said, well, we're not really happy about black people in the movies. And I don't want her to be in the movies. And so by the time he got through telling Mr. Mayer how happy my father himself, he could make me, but they took me. So, and didn't know what to do with me then because I didn't have anything about Tarzan, anything against Tarzan pictures or working for people in the movies or maids and all, but we had never seen anybody like a person be in the movies, So I thought it was very funny when I think about it, but I guess it wasn't.
Well, I remember when you I remember when I sat in on that little interview that you did for Turner,
Mm-hmm.
and you had said, well, gee, I wouldn't have minded being a maid, and you gave this outline of exactly the kind of maid you would have wanted to be. I wondered if you could tell me that.
I don't even remember
You don't
what I
remember?
said because it was so long ago, and to find them having me be a part of the speaking of this, this is entertainment, I doubt, I must have said she wore beautiful clothes and didn't know how to cook and didn't know how to babysit and something ridiculous. But I guess they kept it in.
No, actually, what I'm referring to was a recent thing that they did with you, just back in December, I think it was.
Yeah.
And you had said something to the effect of, yeah, I would have loved to have been a maid, the kind who poisoned the family.
Oh, yeah, that kind of maid I always wanted to be. When they finally said, you got to be in the movies, I said, if I could have a part where I am the head cook in this great old Southern household. And I said, and secretly, if any of them were mean to me, I'd have these potions that I made in their soup, in their gumbo, in their jambalaya, in anything that poisoned slowly all of the members of the family. I said, but they never made that kind of picture. But that I would have loved.
Your screen test at MGM, they actually had burnt cork that they put on you. Could you tell me about that?
While I was at MGM in the beginning, they really didn't know what to do with me, and they didn't know what to make of me. Since they had heard I didn't want to be any other race except my own, they began to test me for working with other black people in the film. See, they were thinking of Cabin in the Sky at first, I think. And they wanted to, since they had decided that the leading man I was working with would be Rochester, who was a famous star, Rochester Anderson, they began to try to get a makeup to make me more colored looking with Rochester and other people standing in for other Rochester's parts. They didn't know that they didn't let themselves know that black people are all shades of the rainbow, so they started putting makeup that they called Negro, or they didn't say black people then, but colored or African. And I began to disappear. The nose didn't stand out, and the lips were not there, and I don't know, it was just the wrong color for me. And so they tried other things and other colors, so they finally said, they had signed me to a 7-year contract, and they said, this 7 years, we got to find something to do with this girl. They must have said that. And so, Jack Dawn, you've got to invent a makeup for her. And they tested all kinds of shades on me, and they finally made one that he called Light Egyptian. And that was the makeup that I wore whenever I was in one of their movies. But meanwhile, Hedy Lamarr wore it to be Tondalea in the movie, and other people who were playing native people and all started wearing Light Egyptian. And I don't know, I was working once at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, and a group of good-looking young people had come in to see, and when I passed by their table, they said, "Oh, Miss Horne, we're so happy to see you because MGM sent us a lot of free makeup when we said that we were opening this little theater company, and it was all Light Egyptian, and we know now what about the color." And I laughed because they didn't know what would happen with that Light Egyptian. It became a very hot number. So it was pretty silly. But I didn't know enough to get on my uppers and say, look, wear all colors, take it or leave it.
Well, before you actually did your first movie,
Mm-hmm.
you had a whole lot of trepidation
Mm-hmm.
about actually doing this Hollywood thing.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me about going back to New York and that Christmas holiday basically spent in New York where Count Basie...
Mm-hmm. When I was being looked over and looked at and decided upon to do in the movies, I always I always ached for New York, and I went and took my pride in my hands and asked to have the Christmas week off, the first Christmas out there at MGM. And if they had nothing for me to do, could I have that week to go home to New York? And I went to New York on the train, and I came in the night that I came in. It was 2 days before New Year's. It was the day before New Year's. I went in a cab, took my bag to the Teresa Hotel. I came back and went to Birdland. And I knew I would find whoever was playing there, plus Basie, plus Billy Eckstine, plus any band leader or anybody else, because we all in those years went there. And I had on my first mink coat that I was paying down on. And I went downstairs into the club, and there they all saw me and yelled, and I went over to the bar, and what are you doing here? Come on, ordering up the drinks. There are a lot of people at the bar, and the seated were over on that side. And I began on my first of the many champagnes I had that night. Charlie Barnett was there. I had worked with him. All the great people in the world. And by the time we left there, I was high. I was with Billy Eckstine. I was with Charlie for a while. I was with Basie. And I forget who else was. But we went walking down the middle of Broadway. It was cold, and the coats were flying in the breeze, mink and everything, and I'm crying. I don't want to go back there. I don't want, because we had naturally talked about the movie, the things, Hollywood. I'm unhappy, I'm miserable. Why can't I be here with you? And that's when Basie, we stopped in the middle of the street, and he said, you have to go back. He said, there's no one out there yet like you. He said, we want to be in the movies too. You have to go back because you've got to make it possible for others of us to go out there. And he was very old-fashioned about the whole thing, but he's brought to life in me this kind of spark. It wasn't always happy, but it was that I must be representative of people. And I'm so glad that is over now. But he made me realize that it didn't matter that I didn't like it and I wasn't happy. But I had been given the job, so I had to do it. And I better be good in it, because we always have to be representative. And that's a hard row to hoe, but he made me go back. I got on the train the next night, and on the 20th Century, and changed and went on from Chicago into L.A. And that's when I went to see Jump for Joy and met Billy Strayhorn.
You needed to meet him at that time.
I certainly did.
Oh, Panama Hattie was your first movie. Do you remember?
I sang a number in my first movie, Panama Hattie. I met and saw them. She was a very nice lady. I think she was the star of it. I don't remember. I wasn't in the picture, but I just did this one song, and Vincent directed me. And I liked him from the very first because I had met him the night I went to see Cabin in the Sky. I think my father took me to see it. The night I went to see it, he was there, Vincent Minnelli, with another producer, I can't remember his name now, famous man. And I met Vincent then. And then when I went there that first day in California, he was there in the room while I was talking to Freed and all these people. And he said, "I'm so glad you're going to be here because we're going to make Cabin in the Sky, and you're going to be in it." It took another year or so before they made it, but that was when... I'm sorry, what was I talking about? Then was Panama Hattie. And
I'm sorry, if you could just repeat that.
The first movie that I was in at MGM was called Panama Hattie. And it was the first time that Vincent directed anything out there. And then the next little piece of, I forget the name of the picture, I sang something in with the Nicholas brothers, and Vincent directed that segment of that picture. And we had become friends by then. And he was marvelous, the most beautiful taste, most beautiful imagination. And he was one of my few friends because he was from New York also. And I would see Gene Kelly and his wife and their friends, and they were New York people. So that I was comfortable with them.
Tell me about the Cabin in the Sky experience. What was it like?
Oh, Cabin in the Sky was wonderful, and our great star, Ethel Waters, was the star of it, and I was certainly nervous to be working with her, and fortunately, Vincent knew how I felt, and he told me how to play in the scenes with her, which I was very grateful for, because it saved them time, the crew and everybody else, and helped me. He taught me how to underplay everything I said in a very kittenish attitude, which played very well against her strength and her thing, which is a strong black woman, you know. And we all, I'm sure, as I've thought about it in later years, have a way, our protection, our survival. We have a way that we protect ourselves, and to protect me from feeling insecure, certainly with a great actress like she was and a great singer like she was. He knew the way to direct me so that my pride wasn't hurt too badly and my insecurity didn't show, because I was very new at all that. Acting, that is. I had just been singing. So he helped me very much in that. And the only other bad thing that happened in the picture was that I broke my ankle dancing in this one number I was supposed to be with Rochester, and I did the last whole part in a cast, the whole part of the movie, and it was an experience. Duke came out by then with his orchestra. They came back and forth, and Pat Swalla was there when I made Stormy Weather, and all the other great people in the world that I knew. So, but that experience was helpful to me. And
It also taught you, and I know that everybody and his mother, father, sister, and brother has asked you about this, and I have to ask you about Ethel Waters too. Because there was what could have been a nasty situation that took place with Ethel because she felt that so much attention was being given to you. Could you just tell me about what happened when the stagehands came over and were paying so much attention to you because you had hurt your leg?
Well, I had had a taste of star people when I worked with Charlie Barnett. We worked at the Paramount Theater, and Dinah Shore was the star. And she sent word that that girl that's with Charlie is not to sing certain things and cut what she does. And I began then to realize what leading ladies or stars, man or woman, do to protect their thing. Now, so it wasn't new to me that people might have thought that I'd be uncomfortable with Ethel. But you see, I knew what she'd gone through. I mean, when I sat back and think of the joints that she had to work in and the audience that before she was the big star on Broadway, she went through hell to be alive and be on the stage. And I just had a taste of it. I mean, I had already begun to be aware of manipulation from both sides. So that I was nervous, of course, and really not prepared to feel secure with her. But the crew that I had worked with in Panama had in the other picture, I don't know what the name was, the crew had taken to me. Now, that was manipulation, too, because they could have made it difficult for her to be friendly to me or be anything because they were sort of one-sided. Now, I don't know what their argument with her had been, but it was a kind of divide and separate that was going on. And I couldn't let it happen because I had too far to go and she had already been there. So the crew did make a lot over me, and then they made it comfortable that the cast could be hidden, and they lit it so that I'd be fine. And I knew how she felt. I know now how she felt. I know, if I had a big lady on the same stage with me, I'd be insecure. I'd make her life miserable, probably. But I think I learned psychologically so much about myself and myself, the other Lena Horne, that I was aware. And so I didn't let them go too far. And fortunately, I only had that one day with her. The rest of the scene was a wreck, I think, collapsing the building and all. But that was an experience. Miss Dunham, I worked with her in Stormy Weather, but she was Miss Dunham. We all had a great thing about her. Well, dancers and musicians are my life, I think. So that, and she was so aloof sometimes that she didn't even make you uncomfortable, Miss Dunham. And it was so beautiful to see her move and work, And she had done so much for so many kids in her dance company. So.
Well, one of the things I guess I would say the blow-up that happened with Ethel sort of also highlighted something else that was happening among the other black actors in Hollywood at the time, because it was very difficult for you to be there. They were afraid.
Well, actually,
could you tell me?
While I was there in Hollywood, I sort of had the one uncomfortable thing I had among a few was the attitude of the black actors while I was there. I don't know why it was such a big thing that they had signed me for 7 years, but that meant every time I did something wrong, they'd put me on. But there was a whole group of them, sort of like a unit of people who'd worked on all the Tarzan pictures, had worked with the stars, had been, in the picture. There was no Nina Mae McKinney there at that time, who had worked but had not been signed for a picture out there. So I was sort of the first, like, again. And they had rented me this house, Felix Young had, in Hollywood on Horne Avenue. And I moved on up the street on Horne Avenue in a bigger house because I had signed at Metro and I could afford these 2 little bungalows, and my baby's kids were there and my cousin. But they lived on another side of town, and every time I got the chance, I went over there to be with them because I wasn't with any of the white stars or actors. And there were those of my people who felt that I might have made it impossible for them to make more pictures like that, or for them to be chosen to work. And that was very unnerving to me at first, because I had gone out there and stayed out there for the NAACP and the Urban League and this, that, and the other organization, and now they were keeping me from friends I might have made. And at that time, they had a wonderful little star, she named Dorothy Dandridge, and they arranged it so I could meet her and talk with her, and found her as unhappy in her situation, and she had been in it a long time, and as unhappy as I was. And I found that my being given this great job didn't make me in any kind of happier circumstance, because I was not allowed to be with girls that had been in the Cotton Club out there, and with Billy Strayhorn came along at the very first moment, because he became my friend to be with me on my other side, the Lena Horne that I am, and because I would have been miserable if that had gone on much longer. They had meetings about it. They called me up. I had to appear in front of them. It was a rough time for everybody. So I got through it somehow, because I always knew I could go back to Cafe Society.
Well, how did the situation resolve itself? Did the actors finally just keep getting this?
When they saw that I wasn't doing no bigger parts than they were, and that it was not a great thing, I think the organizations felt I should have had a better attitude about it, because I was the means of certain things happening. But the actors finally got easy, because I was always with my own people when Billy would take me, and I'd be there, and I made friends who understood, and people like Hattie McDaniels who understood, and who told me I told you, she wore so many hats, one the bandana for the movies and the other hats for her. And I saw that my situation was just another little piece of the whole picture. I was going to be just like my father thought. They're going to give you this one part and that's it. And he was telling the truth. That's what happened. And they weren't any better off either. And they stopped making the Tarzan pictures eventually. And I stopped being tested for a movie that they were going to put Ethel Waters in. And when I heard that, I, went off. But it all worked out. And then 10 years later came Sidney Poitier. I'm sorry.
speaking about it all worked out, you went to parties where people were talking about how important it was to have a part, and your friends were writing things for you. Could you tell me about that, about how you heard that you knew that a part was the key thing, and that you had friends actually who wrote things for you?
Well, I told you that I had this dream about being this great chef in this household. I myself could see on their roster of movies they were going to make that year and the next year would certainly not hold anything for me. And I talked to Catherine Grayson once. She was kind of sensitive, and she knew I was working on this part in the picture they made, Words and Music. They had a picture in there, it had a little piece of Showboat in it. And I was to be Julie, and I was in that one scene where I sang Where or When, I think. I don't know what I sang, just my bill.
I just needed to go back. I think it was Ziegfeld Follies that you did?
Ziegfeld Follies was the second picture I made.
Okay, no, Ziegfeld Follies is the one where you... No, I'm sorry. It's Till the Clouds Roll By. That's
Till the
what
Clouds
you
Roll
wrote.
By, yes.
If we could go back and say that.
When I was put in Till the Clouds Roll By, I was playing the part of Julie in the segment they did about Showboat. And Catherine Dunham was playing Julie. And she turned out to be a very sensitive girl, I think, in many ways. And she said, we talked about this. She said, well, I make a lot of pictures. I'm trying to think whether they had ruled out my doing Julie on Broadway. Mr. Kern himself asked if they could borrow me from MGM to do the show. And they were angry with me at MGM because, so that when they said, you're going to do this little piece of Showboat, and I think I must have heard the punishment. I heard about what happened after I made this scene. Catherine, perhaps I found talking to Catherine Grayson very, very sweet and kind of her knowing a little about me. Wait, I have to cough. I must have been told by MGM that they weren't going to let me go and do Showboat on Broadway. So they put me in this scene with Catherine Dunham, and we both played. I played Julie, she played Magnolia. And in the course of our talking to each other while the cameras were setting up and changing lights and this, that, and the other, it came out that I had so wanted to do that part. I'm sorry. I'm talking too much.
I'm sorry.
I won't come up. I hate this cough. Just a minute. Old age, I guess. Anyway.
You said Dunham again.
I said Dunham? All right. When I was working with Catherine Grayson at MGM in a picture called Words and Music, I think, or Till the Clouds Roll By. I get confused.
Are you familiar with the movies that she's speaking of?
And she and I started talking, and I wasn't in the habit of talking to all the stars out there because I didn't know them. But she was nice. She understood when I told her how unhappy I was at not getting that part, because it would have taken me out of the studio onto Broadway and in New York, where I would be happy. And she told me some of the things that she felt. She had had to sing songs she wasn't crazy about and work with people she wasn't crazy about. We both sounded like the same people on the same track, so it wasn't just me that was miserable, but I liked her ever since that, and she has called me a couple of times. I think she lives down somewhere in Florida or Texas or someplace, and she's still the kind of enlightened, nice woman that I knew. So we both did a scene from Showboat, and I don't know whether she sang Showboat in another movie. Maybe she did. I hope she did anyway.
Could you tell me about the motion picture code that basically was the rationale that they used for not giving you parts?
In MGM, they used the fact that certain of their southern exhibitors and theaters were prejudiced, so that was why I always had to just play a singer in the scene, but not of the picture. I know some of that was true, because I knew that from reading the Army papers of people I know in the camps at Huachuca and Fort Lee that I went around to. They said that to me, and I believe most of it was true. On the other hand, when I got off a cattle car with some guys in the Army in the 40s, you couldn't really travel that comfortably. And a white woman was standing there. She was the station, little Hamburg joint. And she didn't sell, the guys didn't go to her. They had on their uniforms. They were all between camps. But when I went to stood with the guys and said, well, to hell with it, we won't eat. She came over to me and she said, are you Lena Horne? You were in that picture? Till the clouds roll by, or Panama Hat or something. And she said, would you give me give me your autograph? And I said, well, then can we buy some sandwiches? She said, well, no, it's not. We can't afford to sell to. Anyway, those little tiny things are sort of have happened to me in many places, but so has it happened to everybody. You know, I don't think anything's changed very much. Please don't say I said that, if it's bad.
One of the things it's everything you say sparks something else, and I want to go in 1,000 different directions.
Don't, because the crew's going to get tired.
Okay. Well, Nuffy Calloway
Yes.
was telling me about this irate phone call. You were calling her collect because you had just had this horrible experience where your soldiers were seated behind the white prisoners of war. Could you tell me?
Well, I since they, I had started doing USO shows, not with USO proper, but me going around. I had wound up in, I think it was Kansas. What was the name of that camp? Not Fort Lee. It might have been Fort Lee, but it was another camp in Little Rock, outside Little Rock, Arkansas. And I had been ticked off quite a lot going from camp to camp because they either kept me with black officers, and the white guys, who were not even in the same rank of these guys, were allowed to take me around, and I'd have to go in the white officers' building to entertain. So I had put my foot down and said, no, I will sing in kitchens, supply rooms, any place, but I'm not going in the kitchen and eat with you all when the black guys aren't allowed to, you know, in Tuskegee and Fort Lee. But anyway, this place, I had done a show the night before to all the white people on the place and white workers, and I was going to get to sing for black soldiers this next night, and there they were in the back of the auditorium. Not auditorium, it's just a big concert hut or something, and then the white soldiers, and then mingled in with them on one side German prisoners of war and other white prisoners. And I just got choked. And I went to the back where they were sitting and sang with my back to all the other people. And that wasn't very pleasant. They said, get her off these tours. She causes trouble. And I was with Horace Henderson. He was playing piano for me. And I said, we're getting out of here. Come on, let me pick up my bags where they are and get us in a car and go to the nearest NAACP office or hall or church, wherever they are. And there was a little black driver took us in. He had the Jeep, and we went, and I said, now take me to where the NAACP was. And in those days, the NAACP was a flourishing, working organization, had done fabulous work. And I went in, and I said, who's in charge? And then this woman came out. She said, I am. I'm Daisy Bates. And that's how I met another heroine of ours. And I told her what had been going on. She said, it's everywhere like that. So, it'll be cleared up. Mr. Roosevelt will clear it up, probably. Anyway, they threw me out of the USO, so I took my own money and went whenever I could, get space on a train.
Okay. Cut from... Go ahead.
Oh, Lord, I remember that dress.
I wined and dined on mulligan stew.
What do you want me to see?
Okay. What I want, when you look at that woman on
Yeah.
stage, I was impressed when I saw it. I thought, now whose fantasy is that? What was Hollywood making you? Who were you to them?
Somebody who sang a couple of those songs well, did it pretty good. But they really didn't know what else to do with me. I couldn't tap dance like Ann Miller. I couldn't. And in those kind of pictures, they'd had to have a black romantic lead or somebody to be with me in a scene in the picture. I was never in a story. There were never, in these white movies I was in, I don't know what the stories were. Oh, girl, stop. That's awful. I mean, that's nice. I was young but you see, I was, oh, God.
We can stop the torture.
No, yeah, but
Okay.
what?
So in order to escape that, while we're there, while we're in this torture mode, there were some things that weren't quite so torturous. We talked to Hugh Martin.
Yeah, they like their songs sung. Anytime there's a musician who's written a song and he likes the singer to sing it, he wants it all the time. They were Texas boys, very young, and
Just give me their name.
Ralph Blaine and Hugh Martin were working at MGM. They were I call it in the music department, but they had their material in many of the pictures they made. But I liked them, and they liked me because I sang the words well in Love that they wrote, and one silly one called a Brazilian Boogie. Golly. And I've heard from them. One of them's gone, but I heard from them lightly through the years. They were big friends with Kay Thompson. You see, and any link to Kay already I was in that small group.
Well, Hugh actually played Brazilian Boogie for me, but Brazilian Boogie sort of made you famous because...
It did?
Didn't it get you on the cover of Esquire magazine?
No, a picture in Esquire. Yeah, that was Brazilian Boogie. The costume was nice, and that's the first time they had a big color picture of a black woman in that magazine.
Do you remember Saul Chaplin?
Yes, oh yes, because I remember Saul because he's the father of Judy Prince, and Judy and my daughter were girls together, grew up together in Hollywood. she was with her family, and my Gail and she were buddies, and they, went to MGM when they were little girls and saw all the stars. Is there a cough? Well, if I have a cough drop, it's going to screw me up.
Okay, stop. Basically, in order to save your professional life, because you were going nowhere fast in the movies, you renegotiated your contract.
Mm-hmm.
Could you?
Well, while I was in the movies at my lowest peak, I think, I had been put on suspension by the studio. That means no salary. And I was punished because I didn't do a property of theirs that I didn't want to be in. And Joan Crawford called me. I was at MCA talking to someone there, and she came in and she said, I heard about the trouble you're having with MGM. And she said, I've been through my troubles off and on at a couple of these studios. She said, you have to not show that you have any pride at all. She said, you have to go to Mr. Mayor and tell him you have been remiss, you have been wrong, you've been punished, and you're a nice girl who owes them everything, and to try to play the whole thing as a sob scene to Mr. Mayor. And you'll do that all the time. And it took a couple of weeks, but meanwhile, she said, go to MCA. And I said, well, if I can get out of this whole situation. They said, if MGA has you, they will settle the business with MGM, and we will become your managers, which is what I did. I was paying them off for about 10 years, but they bought out my contract, I think. And anyway, I was put back on payroll, and I was sent to work in a lot of cabarets that they owned. Not a lot, but for friends of theirs in cabarets. That's how I got off suspension. But I'll always remember her for that. She was a very interesting lady.
Well, this is also when you began to cabarets really were your bread and butter.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when basically you went out on the road a lot and
Mm-hmm.
you were with Lenny. Is that
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I didn't go out there with Lenny. I knew him like 3 years before we were married, or 2. I get a little caught in the time zones. I worked then in cabaret, in the Shapery in Chicago a lot.
Tell me in the comments, how long did you know your spouse before you got married to him?
In New York, I worked at the Copa. Had a big success there, the first one, I might say, and had an argument with them about ordinary black people coming in to see, and they didn't allow that. But my money came in from working at the Capitol Theater, their theater they owned, and another theater in Pittsburgh they owned, and it was always someplace I could make a living because I had finally said to myself, go and do what you know the best, forget this movie jazz. So I then they'd come. I worked and did a little song in the movie. The last one I think was made, "Meet Me in Las Vegas." I don't remember what I sang or anything, but I remember the dress was white and with crystal beads or something. And that was the last movie I ever made for them. Meanwhile, I had been very successful in New York, for across the river in New Jersey, Bill Miller's Riviera, and the Copa. And I was my darling, the baby had started school, I think, Gail. And I was happy working. And I began to just polish up what I knew and get better and try to get better. And I very seldom went back to MGM, except that they were there for me when a couple of people tried to intimidate me or tried to get in my business. And I called the publicity department out there at MGM, and they were always on the case. So I'm very grateful for one thing they did like that.
Well, you were just talking about polishing up your act.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how important was Lenny Hayden to the polishing of your act?
Well, when we finally got married, see, we were married 3 years before we announced it. He began to work with me musically, and he made wonderful arrangements for me. And they tended to stretch me vocally, and I was learning from that, and I loved working at the Copacabana because I could see all the important people in New York. They came there, but when I talk to you about this, it seems that I was always working and must have been honing my craft, because every place was a new experience and a new lesson and new musicians sometimes. That's the reason I hurried up to try to get one musician with me who really was marvelous and who knew me, like Luther Henderson. And then I wanted to have a bass player and a guitar, and I got all these wonderful musicians. I didn't make any money, but they did, because I knew you had to have important, good musicians if you wanted to be a singer. But that was part of learning more about my craft, because when you're with someone who's familiar with you vocally and so forth, you're happy, you know. And I worked a lot of times, and I worked with all fine musicians if I could get with them, you know. And I didn't pay the movie making much mind, except that when I went in 1947 to England for the first time was my great starring time, because they didn't have the same luggage. They weren't carrying around the same luggage as I in this country. They hadn't yet had a problem with their color races, and they were still in the throes of the Second World War. It was over, but they had nothing. They were still living on coupons. They shared coupons with me. They came to the theater, and a lot of them knew me because they had seen in the troops had on ships and so forth. They had Stormy Weather, which was my big entree to them. But they made me feel like a star for the first time. The Copa and then London, and they took me into their homes, and they shared their ration tickets with me, and I was listened to as an artist, you know, as a performer whom they respected. And there was no back thing about you can't live here and you can't live there, but there was for my musicians. And if they were black, I had to find them someplace that they were allowed to live, or I'd live with them, because England had their problems with color situations. I found it everywhere I go, except the first time I went to Israel. I don't know what it would be like now, but they helped.
Well, one of the other, I had a wonderful time watching some of your performances on Perry Como.
I liked those. Perry was nice. Perry was nice to me on his shows, and I was kept off the show off the American TV and radio for 7 years, I think, because I was Red Channel and listed as a communist and so forth. And so I worked in Europe a lot. And when I came back here, I think Dave Garraway, who used to be a host on a great show from here, he gave me a job, and Steve Allen gave me a job on his show, because I was just not there as far as the media here was concerned. But I was free in London, and as a performer and as a person. And that's when we got married, over there in France. Me and Lenny, I mean.
Did the marriage raise any hackles among the black community?
Oh, of course. Members of my family didn't speak to me for 3 years, and they finally, I was finally let out. But so were a lot of people at that time of MGM, and my husband eventually. And Tex McCrary, who's an old friend of mine, who used to have a famous talk show with he and his wife, Jinx Falkenberg, and he did a poll taking, had mail rerouted to him through the COPA and everything, and there was a great to-do among black people because I had been the first and they didn't want me to, and he got letters, of course, from white people, but white people didn't know that much about me as my own people did, so that the crux of the problems came from them, who were. It sounds so silly to say it now, but I find that there's still parts of that going on in the country. But he said that the mail has been enormous and they're all against it. But so we had to weather it out, and I went back abroad and worked, and finally got put back on the TV here.
In your interview with Ed Bradley,
yes,
you had told him, and you've said this at other times too, that initially it wasn't so much love that brought you together.
That's right. I married Lenny, I guess for selfish reasons. I liked him very much, and I think he liked me. But I said this once to Nina Simone, whom I liked very much, and she said, hallelujah, she patted her foot. We didn't have a black man like Barry Gordy at that time. And we didn't have any black entrepreneurs like Cosby and all this. We didn't have anybody to fight this battle for me. And I don't know what I said to Ed in the program, but and I don't know what the question was. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. We were just talking about why you married Lenny.
Oh, why I married Lenny? Yes. I knew that a white man could get me into places that black men couldn't. I knew that would happen because he was white. They didn't have to know whether I was married to him or anything. So rather cold-bloodedly, I had that in the back of my mind. And I was terribly surprised that he was going to marry me, not because of anything he did or said, but my aunt, my cousins in Chicago, had told me it's terrible to marry a white man because they'll go to bed with you, but they never marry you. Now, that's from another age just before me. That's coming from her. And the reputation of that was like, yes, they'll go to bed with you, but they don't marry you. It was a challenge to me, but main reason why was because I knew he had the entree that I couldn't have with a black man to workplaces. But I learned to love him completely because he took all this out from me and went along with the flow and made me at times to forget he was white. But I don't know why I didn't sit down and tell him the history of jazz, which our grandparents never told us, my generation, and give us all the drawings. I had to get it bit by piece, and I should have sat down and told him about many of the things that made me angry, because he didn't understand what my anger was, and he'd say, "Oh, she's just like that. Don't pay attention to her." And part of the anger was my not having anybody but my closest friends to say all this to, because I didn't want to, when I found out he was such a decent guy, I didn't really want to tell him what I felt. And I learned to love him, and I traveled all over with him. He and I worked as a great unit. And we made a good marriage for 20-some-odd years. And part of that was because in the 60s he realized what I felt. And a lot of people learned some few things during the 60s.
The 60s were a watershed period for you.
The 60s were a sort of watershed period, yes, because it brought kind of new understanding with my husband and made me feel close to my grandmother for the first time. It's just, you're exposed the most to the other people in those years who came in the clubs to see you. My own people couldn't for a long time. So that I always missed being with my race. And when I came to life because I knew I had a right to be in the 60s. I had a right to be absorbed in it because my family, my grandmother and my grandfather and my great-grandfather had been fighters all the time. The Indian side was fighting to get a piece of ground to sit on, and the black people in my family, and I just didn't feel I could be family. You really had to, you didn't have to, but you did draw sides. You did go to the side that you wanted to be with, the one that I most admired, the people who were decent. We were going through some rather bad times there, and yet I knew that one of my grandparents had trouble being welcomed in a restaurant and having a place and not having his stuff bombed out or burned out. I had a right to be involved in the 60s, and I just knew that I had to be with brave people who had to be brave, and it was a way of finally getting that part of me out. Yeah.
When you were singing This Little Light of Mine to Jake the other
Yeah.
day, it made me think of what Gene Noble told me about when you and Billy Strayhorn did This Little Light of Mine for the NACP rally. Do you remember that? Could you tell me about
Well,
that?
I wanted to go south very badly, and Billy's, and part of that was also fueled by a James Baldwin piece that ran in the New York magazine, New Yorker. I don't know whether you had The Fire Next Time, but that was the title. And I read that in one, I had all the copies that was given me through text. I read it all in the 2 days it took to cross country coming back from California. And there was a couple on the train that knew me and white people. And I came out that second day, and I was still shaking. And she said to me, "What's the matter with you?" I said, I've just read James Baldwin's pieces in the New Yorker. I have got to be around people like this who are, when you put your stamp of approval on it, who are the people whom I want to be with, because I feel so close to him. And the piece just destroyed me, and it made me also strong. And he came to New York, James Baldwin came to New York, and I was with him at a very important meeting we had with Robert Kennedy and some other people. And I began to feel myself again, because I wasn't singing or dancing or entertaining, but I had the right to be with them as a black woman, not as Lena Horne. But I guess Lena Horne was rather valuable in some instances. The name was valuable, and through the name, I could get to certain people and certain places. So on the other hand, I guess MGM helped a bit.
Well, do you remember that night with Medgar Evers?
I remember, yes. I went down there with Billy Strayhorn to play piano for me, and I was going to work for the Southern Leadership. Julian Bond met me in Atlanta, and we talked about that outfit, and I went on down to Medgar's home, Mississippi, to be in them, to see him, to appear at a church, to meet people. And I came a day earlier, and I was driven around the town, and that's when he said to me, he said, "I love my country here." He said, "I'm from Mississippi. I love it. It could be a wonderful place where..." That was the first kind of black man like that I had the pleasure of getting to, because I had either been with entertainers, musicians, husband, or acquaintances, and all the people that are always in a group. It's the first time I ran into a man that I thought sounded like what I had heard from Paul Robeson about my grandmother and my grandfather. And I went there, and he was a wonderful man, strong, physical, aggressive, nice, sweet family, and working with people who were trying to get voter permission for black people. And he said to me that day, he said, "Would you mind living at so-and-so's house? Because they bombed my place the other day, and we haven't finished fixing it up." And I said, And I went to the church that night with Bill and was not prepared for it, but felt it, that church full of people who were in the thick of trying to be real. And they put up with what I did. I mean, it wasn't anything they were used to hearing, but I did it, and I sang this little light of mine. That's the one thing they could hear, that I had maybe been around some of my own people. And that's, of course, when Dick Gregory was on the stage with me and other people, and he got up and started talking about, "You blue-eyed people who you're not supposed to have blue eyes," and my son had gone with me, and he's sitting there with these big blue eyes, blue-green, and I felt so insulted for him, but I understood the whole thing because he was making a point. Dick Gregory was making a point. But that was quite a night. And then I got back to New York, and the next morning I was going to go on NBC to do a show with Brinkley, which was the one who just died, Chet Huntley. He was to be the master of ceremonies, and we were I was waiting in the makeup room or somewhere to go on, and he came in the room and he said, we're going to be a little late starting because they've just killed Medgar Evers. And I said, went off. What? And then it just came out, and when they put me on the air that morning, I was black and proud of it. I mean, really, honestly, that pride, that was where my grandmothers came from. And we were all angry. But, it wasn't a surprise. It's never a surprise when you know what is going down. When you know what's being put down, you know how to you cannot be unaware. So that they killed him was just a forerunner of some more stuff they did, He was quite a man. And then, of course, now the wonderful young black men who are making his dream come true. Some of them probably in Mississippi doing that.
Malcolm X.
Mm.
How did you feel about him?
Well, I met him a long time ago, Gene said, just before he became Malcolm X. But I read his book, the one that Alex Haley wrote, also going on the train to visit the great white woman who was senator. I forget her name. But not a senator, she was in the House of Representatives. Anyhow, I read that in the 2 days it took us. And that was the other book I read that just dissolved every thought of being addlepated and believing anything that anybody said to me. That book was a head opener, really, for me.
So you then became pretty much involved with the National Council of Negro Women.
I did. I became involved with the National Council of Negro Women at that time, and I had never wanted to be in a club or be a joiner or this, that, and the other, because they had always said to me many times when I was fighting in cabarets for my musicians or something, they'd say, come on, be with us. Why are you like this? Why are you angry? And I had known only certain types of people. I didn't know the wonderful women who were lawyers, doctors, hairdressing, owners of hairdressing salons. I didn't know so many wonderful black women. And I had been so hungry for that kind of knowledge for so long. And I went south with them. I found myself down there, people who knew me when I was a little girl, and when I'd been one place or another, and even ran into one of the girls I had lived with in Macon, Georgia. And my whole life, I meet these people whose homes I'd stayed in or who've seen me near the houses where I used to live. And that opened me more. And I felt I began to respect even the cafes that I worked in and all that, because it was just getting me together so I was useful to some other people. It's hard to explain what I felt. And when we went to colleges, and they had seen me in a movie, these people, and they met me in person, and it was, I just said, well, I was for real to them in the movie, but now I'm here. And it was an experience I can't describe. It was wonderful. And gave me so much more respect for, because when you feel you're by yourself, you get into that little selfish rut where you think, well, me, 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 me. And you go out and you find somebody as bad off as you are, but moving onward with it and being brighter and smarter than you are. You just have to admire that.
Well, that's, and we're almost at the end now, but I just want to take you into what you did with this new energy, with this new Lena.
Well,
Lena.
it took me into touring for fundraising for them. Took me into working more and more to my own people, turning me to the edge I should have on certain songs because it was about them and me, honing that craft again, you know. And it led me up until finally my present manager, Sherman Sneed, said to me, "You just can't stop singing," because I said, "Oh, well, I'm going to sit down now and not think about the stage. I'm tired of it." He said, "You've got to do something," and it led to Lady in Our Music, the last show that I did.
Now, when you...
Sorry. When I, what?
Started thinking about the Lady and Her Music, did you know what it was going to be?
No, I didn't know. When I started to think about the Lady and Her Music, it wasn't the Lady and Her Music. I was out in Santa Barbara. I was very happy. I had just finished working probably again in San Francisco. And Sherman said one day to me, "Are you going to work again, ever?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to do something on the stage. Why can't some of these summer revivals and shows put me on in those parts?" I said, "I don't want to be Hello Dolly, and I don't want to be whatever else there was around." I said, "I want to do something, though. I want to do it in New York." And so he kept on at me. And so I finally said, "Well, go to New York and find out if there's going to be a summer reproduction of some show, some Broadway show, and see if I can get a job in it." And I think that he went right to the Nederlander office. I guess he knew people up there. And he said, he called me on the phone. He said, "Come on to New York because I think we may be able to get something." So I came to New York, and he took me back up to Mr. Nederlander's office, nice man, and said, "Have you got anything you want Lena to do that she can be in?" And he said, "Sure." I said, "I'll put her in one of my theaters." He had a lot of theaters. He owns a lot of. And he said, "I'll put her on with some Italian singer, Franco somebody, I don't remember, a man singer." And I said, "Well, I don't want to do that. I've already sung with men, And had been a long tour with Tony Bennett at that time. So Mr. Nederlander said, "Well, let's get some people in here to think about what you could do." And he says, "I'd love to do a show with a man singer and have it on Broadway, have it on one of my theaters." So Sherman and I went away and we talked some more to ourselves about it. And we went back and he said, "I'm going to hire a writer to write a piece for you." And they got in a marvelous writer named Sam Hott Williams. He's written so many beautiful things. And he came out back to California with me to see how I lived out there and everything. And the whole thing that I'm going through with you seemed to be interesting to him, and he began to write. And when they read it to Nederlander, he said, "Well, now, that's not very commercial, and what's she going to sing, and this, that, and the other." So Sherman said, "Well," to me, he said, "Why don't we just go and work out some songs, and do you have all the material?" And I said, "Say that to Mr. Nederlander," and I think he did. I mean, he was marvelous. He got it so I was prepared to go and do a show on Broadway. I was going to have some singers and maybe some dancers. I don't know. As it worked out, I said, the things that I've been singing all these years, matches up with certain times in my life that I have lived through. So why don't we say, well, it's about, it's about your life, and you'll say, well, that was the year I sang so-and-so and so on. But that wasn't quite right to me. And we began to rehearse with some kids and with a choreographer whose name I don't remember. And I always talk a lot. I know you notice, I'm sorry. And I would talk while the number was being played. I say, oh, that was when I did so and so and so. And they, without my knowing it, they had somebody in there taping all the rehearsal times with what I was saying, which did become the libretto of the show, because it was worked out so that Mr. Niederlander said to me before the first day of rehearsal, he said, whatever you do, Lena, no politics, no politics. He was probably remembering my Red Channel days. And it worked out, amazingly enough. And I had great people with me, and great musicians, whom I always want. And I thought I'd be there 4 weeks. A month, and like it ran longer than that. It was a special time because they were like another family again, and I met people from all around, and we had our share of fans who follow us from place to place, and one besotted person who we had to get the police. I shouldn't even think about her, but the more I hear about, I find that people are as crazy now as they were when I did that show, obsessive things that they create about you. And I had not talking about the show, but I had a girl who was my daughter. I had a son who even went around town getting money, saying he was Lena Horne's daughter. And I've had everything. It was fun, the whole thing, in a terrible way.
Well, you'd had another family with Jamaica.
Yes, that was my first family, out of the Cotton Club.
Now, Jamaica was with Bobby.
Bobby Lewis, my director, yes. I like him very much. And I think he knew just what to say to me. And Ricardo Montalban, who was in the show with me, he was very nice. But the dancers and the singers and the musicians, that was it. We had Alvin Ailey, Claude Thompson, Louis Johnson, Nat Horne, all the great dancers, male dancers and female. And not Pearl, I forget her name. Oh, she was wonderful. She became such a close friend. Anyway, I had that first family, and that sort of cooled me down for the next 10 years. It's been in spurts.
Do you remember?
Back on okay?
Yeah.
I think the thing that was difficult in the beginning with Jamaica was that it had been written for Harry Belafonte, and he didn't want to do it for some reason or other. And so they called me in. I think I was living here in New York then, and Lenny was here, and they said, you do this part, even though it was written for Harry, we'll just change it into a girl's part, and we'll write a great ballad for you. Well, I never got the ballad, suffice to say, but I didn't know. I hadn't been in a Broadway show before, and I didn't know the Sturm and Drang, really, that there would be writers who don't want a word taken out of their script, choreographers who can't work unless everybody's ballet trained, stars in the show. I mean, I didn't know about all that. It was fascinating to me. And I mean, the writers went crazy. First of all, because they had written for a guy, and they had to make it feasible for me to do it, and that ain't easy. And they had a whole concept that was about a male character. And so it wasn't easy to get, and they wanted to get a strong box office name. They didn't think it had a strong name, and they didn't want a black leading man particularly. And which I said, now wait a minute, we got to get this straight. If you're not going to have a black leading man that I like and you like, then you got to get an Hispanic man. So they auditioned people, and I didn't come around in the auditions and all. And they even auditioned white leading men. But I said, now wait a minute, if we're going to do this thing, we've got to be an interracial show, and somebody that's not white has got to be the leading man. I'm sure Ricardo didn't think of himself in that manner, but I did. I know that a Latin was like me, like I am, with the same problems, the same... I didn't think he had a problem, but he probably didn't, but he was happy to do the show, I think. I don't know what made him do it, but I was happy with him. And we had an interracial. We had Charlie Blackwell, my stage manager, who was the first black stage manager they had at that time. And I had black orchestra with some white members in Jamaica. And we had Orientals, Spanish, island people, all sorts in the whole chorus and all. And I was happy to have them because I didn't know a thing about. They raised big advance sale, the biggest it had ever been. In fact, they were going to have it in Life magazine, but that's the time they put up the first moon shoot. And so we were knocked off the front page. But we had an ideal, beautiful company. And we thought, it would happen more and more.
This family.
Yeah.
Josephine Premise.
Yes, she was in it. And rather like Hazel Scott, we became friends because she had her Haitian beliefs and independent spirit and so forth, and I had my thing, and we were good friends because she's a very down-to-earth person, and she wasn't one of those girls that said, now, if I were you, I'd do this and that and the other, and can I give you some advice? She would just, because she had been on the stage a lot, and I hadn't, but she was on the ball, and she encouraged me and helped me a great deal. She's a great performer. And we became good friends. She liked Lenny. I met her husband. I was there when her first child, I was overseas when he was born, when her daughter was born, and then I knew her second child when he was a baby, and taught her how to burp the baby, because she didn't know that. She was giddy and in Rome and very marvelous, and said, he's so unhappy, his little tummy's by him. I said, well, you should put him over your shoulder and do that and burp him, and he'll feel better. And sure enough, he did, eating all that pasta.
You also liked her father a lot.
My father?
No, Josephine's father was always
Yes.
visiting.
Oh, great gentleman. Great gentleman. And he had fled away from Haiti. And her sister, very sweet, marvelous girl. And he liked me because, I don't know, we took to each other, and I had manners for him, good manners for him, because that's what he asked for. And he was the spirit of my grandfather, sort of reminded me of him. Yes, I made friends in both shows. And my manager was right. He told me I should do Late in the Music. I said, well, I'll do it for a couple of weeks, 4 weeks, and then let me get out of here, because... but he thought it would be better than I did. I said, I know, that's it,
Well, that's when you met Jean Noble, isn't it?
I met her in Jamaica. I met Jean Noble and I forget the other woman's name. Patricia. At the same time, they came often to Jamaica, and they finally came backstage and everything, and that's when they said, you got to become a Delta. And I said, I didn't go to college. I didn't go to school. They said, but that's all right. You'll be an honorary member. I said, I'm not a good club person. I don't like things. I don't like to play bridge. I thought they were just, I don't like to play bridge and have parties and everything. I had that in Brooklyn when I was a little girl. They said, no, it isn't like that. You'll find out. I said, well, and there was also another friend there at the same time, Marietta Dockery, who wanted me to be an Alpha, but my uncle had been an Omega, and Delta is their sister organization, and my Uncle Burke and my Uncle Frank. And I said, all right, they kept, and they began to embarrass me. They said, you just can't just know the people that you're on the stage with. There are other people around. I found it safer to be with real people than people in the outer world.
Please take this time and go into the comments and let me know your thoughts about this video. This is part 2 of the best interview given by Lena Horne.